80,000 years ago, every human being on Earth who was not standing on a specific hilltop on the island of Borneo died. Not most people, not a lot of people. According to the research we're diving into today, essentially everyone. Today, we're unpacking the Toba super eruption of 80,000 BC, specifically what made it a planetary-scale catastrophe, who the survivors at a place called Bukit Kilim actually were, and how that single event may have sparked the very first human writing system. By the end of this episode, you'll have a completely different picture of where human civilization actually begins. I've got someone here who has gone deep into this research, and I want to start with the most basic question that I think will immediately break people's brains. Just how big was this thing?
So the framework we need to start with is the Volcanic Explosivity Index, the VEI scale, which volcanologists use to measure eruptions. The 1991 eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines is the largest volcanic eruption in the telecommunications age. It was a VEI 6. The Toba eruption of 80,000 BC was a VEI 8. And here's where people's intuition completely fails them, because they hear 6 and 8 and think, okay, that's like 33% bigger. But the VEI scale, like the Richter scale for earthquakes, is expressed in exponential notation. So the actual difference between a VEI 6 and a VEI 8 is not 33%, it's 2,000%.
Wait, 2,000%?
2,000%. And to make that real, consider what Pinatubo actually did. During its explosive phase alone, Pinatubo threw 10,000 square kilometers of volcanic rock into the air. It pumped 20 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. That was enough to haze up the entire planet's atmosphere between 1991 and 1993 and lower Earth's mean temperature by 0.5 degrees Celsius. That was a VEI 6. Now multiply every single one of those numbers by 20.
That is genuinely hard to hold in your head.
It is. And the research we're drawing on makes the point that the VEI scale itself only goes to 8, not because eruptions can't exceed that, but because nobody ever imagined they would. Toba used every last inch of the scale and then some. The argument being made is that Toba wasn't even just a single caldera event. It was likely a super eruption, meaning volcanic activity at multiple points along the India-Pacific tectonic plate boundary simultaneously. The scale of the Toba caldera itself is so large that it requires volcanic activity exceeding all but a handful of calderas in the known world.
So why then? Why 80,000 BC specifically?
This is where the geophysics gets really interesting. The argument is rooted in what happens at the end of an ice age. When a planet loses its polar ice caps as rapidly as Earth did around 125,000 BC, you get a sudden redistribution of mass across the planet's surface. And that redistribution changes the planet's center of gravity. The kinetic forces that generates, particularly at the crust-mantle interface, where the tectonic plates meet, are, and I'm quoting here, phenomenal. The India-Pacific plate boundary is where the planet adjusts when that mass redistribution happens. And in 80,000 BC, that adjustment was Toba.
So the Ice Age ending is what set the eruption off?
Essentially, yes. The rapid warming at the end of an ice age primes the planet for a volcanically active period along major magma seams. And the research makes this striking comparison. If you detonated every nuclear weapon on Earth simultaneously along the India-Pacific plate boundary, it wouldn't budge the plate in either direction. That's the scale of force we're talking about. The redistribution of mass from a melting ice cap rips the plate apart.
Okay, so we've established this thing was incomprehensibly large. Now let's talk about what it actually did, because the destruction wasn't just local, right?
Not even close. The explosive phase of the Toba eruption lasted 9 consecutive days. 9 days of unrelenting eruption. And the ash fallout from Toba covered, and this is the claim in the research, not 1 square inch of the planet was left uncovered. To give you a concrete example of how we know this, in the Blombos Cave on the southern tip of Africa, archaeologists found a carved piece of red ochre immediately above the Toba ash layer. Think about that. Ash from a volcanic eruption in Indonesia lay thick enough inside a cave in South Africa to form a discernible layer that archaeologists can accurately date artifacts by today.
That's wild. South Africa from Indonesia.
And within the immediate fallout cone, the zone of obliteration, ash depths exceeded 20 feet in places. The research describes the Indian subcontinent as essentially obliterated, the majority of it. And then beyond the obliteration zone, you had a toxic zone, and beyond that, a poisonous zone. and then what the research calls the Klingon zone, regions where it was plausible, though not likely, that species clung to life in significant numbers.
The Klingon zone. I love that framing, actually. It makes it visceral.
It does, and the atmospheric effects compound everything. The research argues that the super eruption caused a significant reduction in the total volume of the planet's atmosphere. The volcanic plume from a VEI-8 event is certain to have filled the mesosphere. For reference, the 2032 Tonga-Hunga eruption was only a VEI-5, and it was the first volcanic eruption on record known to have thrown ejecta into the mesosphere, reaching no less than 58 kilometers into the atmosphere. Toba was 2,000% more powerful than Pinatubo, which was itself far larger than Tonga. The particulates Toba injected into the atmosphere were resident there for years, potentially decades.
And the rain, you mentioned a deluge. That's not just a metaphor here.
No, and this is where the research gets into something genuinely startling. The eyewitness accounts, and we'll get to where those come from in a moment, describe the resulting rain as immediate, toxic, relentless, and lasting for over a month. The atmospheric conveyor that normally pumps water vapor from the equatorial oceans up through the troposphere and stratosphere essentially came crashing down all at once. Everything that had been pumped up came down. And it wasn't just water, it was toxic ash, suspended in water. For months, no creature on the Asian continent drank water that wasn't immediately toxic or carcinogenic in the long term.
Okay, so I have to ask, you said eyewitness accounts. Who was alive to witness this, and how do we have their accounts?
So this is where the research takes a turn that I think is genuinely provocative. The accounts being cited are from the Arabian canon and Hindu scriptures. The Arabian text describes, and I'm quoting directly, "In the second month, the 17th day of the month, the same day where all the fountains of the great deep broke up and the windows of heaven opened." The Hindu tradition describes Vishnu and his wife Lakshmi rescuing mankind from the ocean of milk. The research argues these are not metaphors. They are literal descriptions of what survivors witnessed.
The ocean of milk, what does that actually refer to?
So the research offers a really specific explanation for this. The Toba eruption ejected over 240 cubic kilometers of rock equivalent as ejecta. Ash suspended in the ocean, then carried along Asia's coast by prevailing ocean currents, would have turned the surface of the ocean a milky white for weeks, possibly months. The research describes it as an ash-gray pallor laninated over the affected ocean regions. Anyone who survived the initial explosive phase and was on the water would have been sailing through what looked like a white ocean. That's the ocean of milk. It's a literal description.
That reframes everything about how we read those ancient texts.
Completely. And the research makes the point that the only reason we find this inconceivable, that cultural memory could sustain the memory of a natural disaster from 80,000 years ago, is because we were conditioned to believe that ancient peoples were incapable of that kind of cultural continuity. But when you consider that our ancestors lived through 11 ice ages and potentially 11 such super eruptions, the question flips. How could any culture not maintain such traditions?
Okay, so let's get to the survivors, because this is the part that I think is the most human part of this whole story. Who actually made it through?
So the research identifies a very specific group of survivors, the Archaic Dayak of Borneo, who were on the summit of a place called Bukit Kilim when Toba erupted. And their location is key. Borneo was upwind of Toba. The prevailing winds in that region blow westward, so the immediate fallout cone blew west. The research notes that even the westernmost tip of Borneo was within the easternmost edge of the cone of destruction, so they were right on the boundary. But being upwind, being on high ground, and critically, having access to longboats, those are the three things that determine survival.
Longboats, so they were already seafarers.
The research argues yes, and makes the case that anyone who was not already living on the coast was essentially doomed. If you survived the explosive event, you were in a race against time and the elements. The grayer your survival zone was, the faster and farther you had to move. And the research makes this observation that I find genuinely moving. It's the memory of this ancient, desperate exodus that is recalled in the dragon boat races of Asia today. Those races are a living cultural memory of people loading every available longboat with their kin and their kit and making for the coast without rest.
I did not expect to feel something about dragon boat races today, but here we are.
Right? And the research traces the survivors' route eastward, because east was the only direction that offered any hope. The research identifies Taiwan as a critical bridge, with Hainan also having adequate fresh water from natural springs to support human populations initially. But Hainan was deprived of its tidal ecology, meaning survivors there faced famine almost immediately. The research concludes that all who did not evacuate from Hainan to Taiwan perished. Taiwan then became a bridge to the Philippines.
So the entire human population that survived was essentially funneled eastward through this corridor.
That's the argument. And the research notes a tragic irony here. For everyone living upwind of Toba, their close proximity to the source of destruction is actually what saved them. The fallout cone blew west, so the people closest to Toba on its eastern side were in the survival zone, while people thousands of miles away to the west were obliterated.
That is genuinely counterintuitive. Being close to the volcano saved you.
If you were on the right side of it, yes. And the research also notes that anthropologists have estimated only about 26,000 people were alive on the planet when Toba erupted. But archaeologists have recently proven that a community of toolmakers had a factory on the Malaysian peninsula nearby, so there were people there. The question is, how many of them made it?
And the eyewitness accounts from Bukit Kilim, what do they actually describe seeing?
The research cites accounts describing the fountains of the Great Deep breaking up and the windows of heaven opening, which it interprets as describing an atmospheric collapse, a terrifying and monstrous storm erupting within the vortex of the super eruption. The acoustic report, the sound wave itself, was so loud it rebounded around the planet entirely and persisted for 9 days without relent. And then the accounts describe everything which breathed the air dying. Every living substance on the dry land was destroyed, and only those present at Bukit Kilim survived.
Only those present at Bukit Kilim. That's an extraordinary claim.
It is. And the research is careful to note that the super eruption was not just a volcanic event, it was a planetary earthquake, a planetary superstorm, and a planetary tsunami, all wrapped into one catastrophic eruption that likely involved the Pacific Rim in its entirety. And before Toba had finished its explosive phase, the ash cloud it was pumping into the atmosphere had traveled completely around the world and blotted out the sun. The research ends that section with the phrase, "Darkness was again upon the face of the deep."
Darkness upon the face of the deep. That's Genesis.
Exactly. And that's the thread the research pulls on next, because every major origins narrative in the world reflects on this disaster. The Shinto Kojiki, the Hindu Puranas and Vedas, Genesis, the Maya and Inca calendars that actually mark the day of ultimate doom, Norse Ragnarok, every single one of these traditions asserts an earlier age in history characterized by darkness and chaos. The research argues these are not coincidentally similar. They are all cultural memories of the same event.
Okay, but I want to push back on that a little because the skeptic in me says, couldn't these just be universal human anxieties about catastrophe? Every culture fears the end of the world.
That's a fair challenge, and the research actually addresses it directly. The argument isn't just that these traditions share a theme of apocalypse, it's that they share specific, concrete details that only make sense if they're describing the same physical event. The ocean of milk, the fountains of the great deep, the windows of heaven, the darkness. These aren't vague fears. They're specific descriptions that correspond to specific physical phenomena we can now explain through volcanology and atmospheric science. The research argues that's not coincidence.
And then there's the iconographic record, which is where this story takes a turn I genuinely did not see coming. Can you walk me through what that actually is?
So the research describes a writing system that was deciphered in 2011, which the author is calling iconographic writing. The key claim is that this writing system begins in 77,000 BC, following the Toba eruption. And what makes it unlike any writing system we typically think of is that it modulates visual information, not verbal information. It's based on cartography. The compositions are essentially maps of realms, with icons representing the principal institutions and leadership structures of archaic societies.
So the first writing system wasn't words, it was maps.
That's the argument. And the wisdom of a visual markup language becomes immediately clear when you consider the context. Survivors from multiple different linguistic groups scattered across a vast region needing to communicate across language barriers. A system based on visual geography rather than spoken language would work across all of them. The research has documented this writing system in use prior to 1500 BC on every continent in the world except Antarctica.
Every continent. That's a global claim.
It is. And the discovery began with something called the Bryn Celli Thi pattern stone, a megalith discovered buried beneath a mound on the Isle of Anglesey in Wales in 1929. In archaeological contexts, radiocarbon dated to 3,500 BC. The research argues this isn't art, it's a constitution, a document detailing the structure and function of an archaic kingdom, rendered in iconography based on the cartography of that kingdom's territory.
A constitution carved in stone in 3500 BC.
And then the research extends to the Dama de Elche, a carving from around 400 BC found in Spain, previously thought to be a Carthaginian funerary urn. In profile, the Dama de Elche is revealed to be a composition based on cartography. The shape of the carving corresponds to a satellite image of Spain and Portugal. The research describes this as nearly irrefutable evidence of a writing system based, in part, on cartography.
And the rules of this system, how did it actually work?
The research lays out 3 core rules. Rule 1, the constitution had to look just like the realm it documented. The borders and general details were all based on cartography. Rule 2, the king had to look like the kingdom. This is the research's explanation for all the fantastic headdresses of archaic rulers. The headdress was a representation of the geographic shape of the realm. Rule 3, every station of the nobility had to be represented by icons within the boundary of the realm, almost always in geophysical relationship to each other.
So when you look at an Egyptian pharaoh's headdress, you're actually looking at a map.
That's exactly the claim. The research applies this to the entire Egyptian pantheon. Each Egyptian god is described as a bust depicting the regional geology of Africa in anamorphic similes. Horus, for example, originates in geology resembling a perched Egyptian black kite, specifically the geology of Egypt west of the Nile. The Great Pyramids of Giza are situated precisely on what would be the nose of Horus in the iconographic composition. And the research argues that's not coincidence. The nose in iconographic compositions was always the sovereign's mountain, and Egypt's nobility built their mountain where the iconography said it should be.
That is a completely different way of looking at the pyramids.
And the technique used to create these cartographic compositions is what the research calls solarimancy. The technical process is actually straightforward. You place a staff upright in the ground, mark the tip of its shadow, wait for the shadow to move, mark the new position, and draw a line between the 2 marks. That gives you a perfect east to west line every time. The research claims this technique remains more accurate than modern GPS satellites.
A stick in the ground, more accurate than GPS. I'm skeptical, but I'm listening.
The logic is that the sun is an absolutely consistent reference point, more consistent than satellite signals, which can drift. From that east-west baseline, you use the staff as a surveyor's instrument, aligning it to landmarks on the horizon and tracing those lines. The research walks through exactly how Moses would have used this technique on Mount Sinai, climbing to the highest peak in the region, which the research identifies as Mount Catherine, and using 40 years of shepherd's progress through the Sinai Peninsula to build up an increasingly detailed cartographic record embroidered on his robes.
Moses' robes as a map. And the burning bush?
The research argues the burning bush that was not consumed is a literal description of the iconographic map Moses produced of the kingdom of Midian, a bush-shaped cartographic composition of the wadis and ridgelines of the Sinai, which, when rendered in the solarimancer's technique, produces a form that resembles a burning bush. The research is explicit that this is not metaphor, it's a description of what the iconograph looked like.
Okay, I want to zoom back out for a second, because I think there's a thread here that connects everything. The survivors at Bukit Kilim, the iconographic record, the world's religious traditions. What's the through line?
The through line is this. The survivors of the Toba Super Eruption of 80,000 BC were not just survivors, they were the founders. The research argues that the iconographic record begins in 77,000 BC, meaning within roughly 3,000 years of the eruption, the survivors had developed a writing system sophisticated enough to document the structure of their societies, map their territories, and communicate across language barriers. And that writing system persisted, in use on every continent, for tens of thousands of years.
So the catastrophe didn't just nearly end humanity, it may have been the catalyst for human civilization.
That's the provocative implication. And the research makes the point that the allusion to the phoenix, the avian familiar which survived this ancient catastrophe, compels us to anticipate that the iconographic record may actually predate the super eruption of 80,000 BC. In other words, there may have been an even earlier civilization whose records were preserved in iconographic form and carried forward by the survivors.
A civilization before the civilization we thought was the first civilization.
The research refuses to call anything before the super eruption prehistory because all major religious traditions recall it. The argument is that if the Shinto Kojiki, the Hindu Puranas, Genesis, and Norse Ragnarok all assert an earlier age in history, then that earlier age is history. We may not have a written record from before the eruption in the conventional sense, but the iconographic record is a written record. We just didn't know how to read it.
And the reason we didn't know how to read it, is that part of the argument too?
Yes, and this is where the research gets pointed. The post-war rules of archaeology establish that if something isn't physically in evidence as an archaeological artifact, it cannot be addressed by accredited academia. The research argues this rule is why a written record in the form of Hindu scriptures, Arabian canon, and Greek cosmogony has been systematically excluded from the archaeological conversation. The research describes this as archaeology choosing to ignore all written narratives it cannot prove or understand.
That's a significant critique of the field.
It is. And the counter-argument the research anticipates is that these are just stories, that you can't use mythology as evidence. But the research's response is that a written record is physical evidence. The Arabian canon's description of the fountains of the great deep breaking up corresponds to a specific physical phenomenon we can now explain. The Hindu ocean of milk corresponds to a specific physical phenomenon we can now explain. At some point, the convergence of independent traditions describing the same specific physical events stops being coincidence.
Let me ask you something that I think a lot of listeners will be wondering. Is there any alternative explanation for the genetic bottleneck we know happened around this time? Because the population crash is real, right?
The population crash is real and documented. The research cites the anthropological estimate of only 26,000 people alive on the planet when Toba erupted. And the research's argument is that the Toba super eruption is the only event in the archaeological and ecological record that could account for a near-extinction event of that scale. The alternative explanations, gradual climate change, disease, resource competition, don't produce the kind of sudden, global, simultaneous population collapse that the genetic record suggests.
And the survivors at Bukit Kilim, the research is specific that it was that location. Why that hill specifically?
The research identifies Bukit Kilim as the summit from which the Archaic Dayak of Borneo watched the eruption. The location matters for a few reasons. It's elevated, which means it was above the immediate toxic fallout at ground level. It's on Borneo, which was upwind of Toba, and the Kapuas River on Borneo provided a fresh water source that was, relatively speaking, less contaminated than the rivers flowing from the Tibetan Plateau, which the research argues were covered in toxic ash for months. The research identifies the Kapuas River catchment as being in what it calls the Klingon zone, plausible but not likely survival, which means the people at Bukit Kilim were right on the edge.
Right on the edge. And they made it.
They made it. And the research describes what they witnessed from that summit. Everything they knew coming to an abrupt, terrifying end. Every civilization, both west and east of Borneo, gone. And then, the research says, only to the east did any hope remain. So to the east, the survivors turned. That eastward movement, through Taiwan to the Philippines and beyond, is the beginning of the repopulation of the world.
And the iconographic writing system, the research says it was in use on every continent. How did it get from Borneo to, say, Wales?
The research argues that the geographical breadth of the iconographic record is evidence of global communication between archaic realms, not just widespread, but genuinely global. The writing system traveled with the survivors as they repopulated the world, and because it was based on cartography and visual information rather than spoken language, it could be adopted and adapted by any group regardless of what language they spoke. The research describes it as the information technology of the archaic world, in use for tens of thousands of years before Egyptian hieroglyphics represented what the research calls an upgrade.
Egypt upgraded to Twitter while everyone else was still using conventional mail. That's a great line.
And the implication is that the conversations happening in Europe, in Asia, in the Americas, all in iconographic writing, were preserved but obscured. We've been looking at Celtic art, at Mesoamerican carvings, at Aboriginal Australian rock art, and calling it art, when the research argues it's language, it's constitutions, it's census records, it's the documented structure of kingdoms we didn't know existed.
So when you step back from everything we've covered today, the eruption, the survivors, the writing system, the religious traditions, what's the thing that you think people should sit with?
I think the thing that's hardest to shake is the realization that the story of humanity is much longer and much more continuous than we've been taught. We tend to think of civilization as beginning around 3000 to 5000 BC, Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley. But the research we've been discussing argues that the iconographic record begins in 77,000 BC. That's not prehistory, that's history. It's just history written in a language we forgot how to read.
History written in a language we forgot how to read. That's the frame that changes everything.
And the survivors at Bukit Kilim are the hinge point. They're the people who stood on that summit and watched the world end, and then made the decision to go east, to load the longboats, to carry whatever knowledge they had into whatever came next. The research argues that the iconographic writing system they developed in the aftermath is the direct ancestor of every writing system that followed, including the one you're using right now to process this conversation.
Here's what this really comes down to, I think. We started this episode with the image of a handful of people on a hilltop in Borneo, watching the world end. And what the research is arguing is that those people didn't just survive, they remembered. They built a system for remembering. And that system of remembering became the foundation of everything that came after. Every map, every constitution, every religious tradition, every story about the end of the world and the beginning of a new one.
And the evidence for that is hiding in plain sight.
In the headdresses of Egyptian pharaohs, in the carvings of Celtic megaliths, in the dragon boat races of Asia, in the robes of Arabian nobility, in the story of Moses and a burning bush. The research argues all of it traces back to that summit, to those survivors, to the moment they looked east and decided to keep going. And the next time someone tells you that ancient peoples were too primitive to have had sophisticated communication systems, or that mythology is just stories, or that civilization only started a few thousand years ago, you now have a very specific, very detailed counter-argument.
The research puts it well. The only reason we find it inconceivable that cultural memory could sustain the memory of a disaster from 80,000 years ago is because we were conditioned to believe it couldn't. But the data is there. The ash layer in the Blombos cave is there. The genetic bottleneck is there. The convergent traditions are there. The iconographic compositions on every continent are there. The question isn't whether this happened. The question is whether we're willing to look at the evidence with fresh eyes.
And if you want to go deeper on this, the research we've been drawing on is published under the name An Unknown Soldier, and it covers not just the Toba eruption, but the full scope of the iconographic record, from the Bryn Cethli Thi pattern stone in Wales to the Egyptian pantheon to the solarimancy of Mount Sinai. It is a genuinely different way of looking at human history.
And the research is ongoing. The next phase involves tracing Asia's 7 major rivers, all of which originate from the Tibetan Plateau as iconographic arms in the Archaic writing system. The headwaters of those rivers, where they converge, is identified in the research as Mount Meru, the sacred abode of Garuda, Asia's guardian familiar. The connections keep going deeper the further you look.
We started this episode with the image of a world covered in ash and darkness, and a handful of people on a hilltop deciding to go east. And here's what I keep coming back to. Every story humanity has ever told about the end of the world, every apocalypse narrative, every flood myth, every tale of divine destruction and renewal might not be a fear of something that could happen. It might be a memory of something that did. And the people who remembered it built a writing system so that we would never forget. We just forgot how to read it.